Good morning, it's Friday the 1st of December here in London. This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, Israel says the temporary Gaza ceasefire with Hamas is over, ending a week-long exchange of hostages for prisoners.
Bloomberg Economics expects a weakening US economy to lead to significant Fed rate cuts next year.
Plus, shock therapy. Tesla delivers its first Cybertrucks, but says the cheapest model will be delayed until 2025.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories. The Israeli army says that it took the decision after Hamas violated the terms of the pause by firing towards its territory. Speaking in Tel Aviv ahead of that move, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken urged Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to avoid the scale of destruction inflicted on Gaza before the truce.
I underscore the imperative to the United States that the massive loss of civilian life and displacement of the scale that we saw in northern Gaza not be repeated in the south. As I told the Prime Minister, intent matters, but so does the result.
Antony Blinken also told reporters yesterday that he was working to extend the temporary truce to get more hostages out of Gaza and more humanitarian assistance in. That objective now looks to have failed. In the last hour, the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak renewed the UK's call for sustained humanitarian pauses in Gaza. Benjamin Netanyahu and other Israeli politicians have consistently stressed that the war would resume at some point and that the truce was not permanent.
Bloomberg Economics says next year will bring 125 points of Fed cuts beginning in March as signs of a US recession begin to appear. The team's baseline forecast is for unemployment to increase through next year and approach 5% by the end of 2024, a mild recession by historical standards. Insignio Chief Investment Officer Ahmed Riazgo said that markets are responding to the same concerns.
Really, over the past several weeks, the bond market is clearly signaling that its attention has shifted from inflation risks to growth and recessionary risks. And you're seeing that with not only sort of the rapid drop in long duration bonds in the United States, but also with the market starting to price in Fed funds cuts as early as March. In fact, at the end of the day today, the market was pricing in roughly a 50% chance that the Fed will cut the rate by March of 2024. So this is much earlier than what we had seen a couple of weeks ago.
Ahmed Riazgo there. Fed officials have shifted their tone in recent days and inched closer to a conversation around cutting rates. Markets in particular have latched onto comments by the hawkish Governor Christopher Waller, who this week opened the door to trimming rates if inflation continues to fall.
The British Prime Minister will pledge to spend £1.6 billion on climate projects as he attends the COP28 summit in Dubai. Almost half of that amount will be new funding, including £500 million to tackle deforestation and £300 million for energy innovation. The UK will also contribute £40 million to a global fund to help vulnerable countries deal with more extreme weather, an initiative that's been unveiled at COP28. Rishi Sunak has defended his party's recent rolling back of green policies.
I'm not in hock to ideological zealots on this topic. Of course we're going to get to net zero, of course it's important, but we can do that in a sensible way that saves people money, and I'm proud of that approach. I think that's the right thing, and I think that actually it's supported by the vast majority of the British public.
Rishi Sunak's trip to COP28 risks being overshadowed by the opposition leader Keir Starmer, who is also attending. He's promising to make the UK the green finance capital of the world.
The Institute of Directors says UK tax cuts won't help to ease economic worries among British business leaders. The group's economic confidence index improved for a fifth month running after plummeting in June when interest rates jumped to 5%. Findings show optimism among company bosses has returned to 2019 levels when leaving the European Union with a no deal was on the cards. UK executives are still struggling to muster enthusiasm for 2024 despite the Chancellor's £20 billion tax cut package. Among their concerns are geopolitical instability, skills shortages and climbing energy costs.
UK regulators will review a £600 million UAE-linked bid for the Telegraph newspaper. Bloomberg's Tiwa Adebayo has the details.
Culture Secretary Lucy Fraser has ordered a probe into the proposed takeover of one of Britain's most famous newspapers due to concerns about accurate reporting and free expression. Media regulator Ofcom and the Competition and Markets Authority will investigate a deal involving the Telegraph and investment venture Redbird IMI, which is backed by Abu Dhabi's Sheikh Mansour. Findings will be published in January next year. The government can then block the deal, impose conditions or allow it to go through. The Telegraph has close connections with the ruling Conservative Party. Former Prime Ministers Boris Johnson and Winston Churchill have both written for the paper. In London, Tiwa Adebayo, Bloomberg Radio.
Tesla has finally rolled out its long-awaited Cybertruck after 2 years of delays and production snags. However, the cheapest model is 2 years behind schedule as the CEO Elon Musk lamented how difficult the steel-bodied vehicle is to produce. Dan Ives, managing director at Wedbush Securities, expects it'll take time for Tesla's pickup truck to become profitable.
First 12 to 18 months, no. I mean, they'll essentially lose money. It'll be cash flow negative. But as you get into 2025, it actually could be pretty significant in terms of the accretive level as it all plays out at scale.
The Cybertruck marks Tesla's first entry into the highly competitive pickup truck market in the US. The move has been met with some excitement, but also heavy criticism and doubt. Let's return for more details on our top story now. The Israeli army saying it's resumed combat against Hamas in the Gaza Strip after that week-long truce. This as the United States has said that Israel must not repeat the scale of destruction and displacement inflicted on the northern Gaza Strip in any further military push against Hamas. Joining us now for more, Paul Wallace, who leads our team of economics and government reporters in the Middle East. Paul, thank you for joining us. The fragile truce is over. What has happened so far this morning?
Exactly. It ended at around 7 a.m. local time or 5 a.m. UK time this morning. Almost immediately, Israel started bombing Hamas targets in the Gaza Strip. It blamed Hamas for this restart. It said that the group had violated the truce that was in place for a week in total. Hamas has subsequently blamed Israel and said that the US also bears responsibility for giving Israel the green light for hostilities to resume. It's not a total surprise that we're now back in a phase of war. Israel and its Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have been very consistent that the truce was temporary, it certainly wouldn't be permanent, and that the country would not be stopped in its goal of destroying Hamas and demilitarizing the Gaza Strip. So it was pretty clear that fighting would begin. It was just a case of when. But clearly, whatever happened last night and early this morning in negotiations between Hamas and Israel over hostages, they couldn't agree to another extension in their truce.
It comes, though, with a strong warning from the US to do more to protect civilians. What does the plan for that look like? How can Israel do both, target Hamas and also protect so many people in the Gaza Strip?
This is the big question, and U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken made pretty strong comments about Palestinian civilians and the need to protect them when he spoke to Netanyahu in Tel Aviv yesterday. He was, in fact, still in the country when hostilities resumed. He left from Ben Gurion Airport shortly afterwards. On the face of it, the U.S. stance is the same, that it backs Israel's goal of destroying Hamas, but it is making a bigger and bigger noise about Palestinian civilians and the need to protect them. Interestingly, Blinken alluded to Israeli forces moving to the south of the Gaza Strip. So right now they're concentrated in the north, which they say is Hamas's center of gravity. But Blinken talked about them moving south, not in a way that he was saying that should happen. He was simply saying that if Israel does move forces into the south, we cannot see the same number of casualties there, civilian casualties, as we have in the north. So it seems as if, at least in the background and in private, the US is increasing pressure on Israel to sort of restrain its operations. But in public, Israel is very much maintaining its strong stance that this war will continue until Hamas is no more.
What about the diplomatic efforts that had been led by Qatar that led to this truce being established in the first place and then extended? Do we know if those efforts are continuing?
We think they are, and Qatar had hoped, and some other Arab governments had also hoped that this truce would turn into something more permanent. I think even though it's broken down, we'll still see negotiations taking place between Hamas and Israel, mostly channeled through Qatar, which has been the main mediator so far. Qatar hasn't said anything this morning about the breakdown in this truce, so we wait to see if they've got any more comment. But it is possible we could see more pauses. And in the last few moments, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who's in Dubai for the COP climate summit, he actually called for further humanitarian pauses as he worded them. So I think we will still see more diplomacy, and it doesn't mean that this is, now that we had 1 week of truce, that's it. There'll be no more stoppages in fighting. It's quite possible that we will get some further down the line. They'll all be dependent on Hamas releasing more hostages from Gaza, and it's thought to still hold about 140 people.
Just lastly, on the tensions in the West Bank, how severe are those currently?
They're rising, and the territory has got more and more restive since this war in Gaza started on October the 7th. We've seen a number of Palestinians killed by Jewish settlers and also by Israeli security forces. It's something that Israel is worried about. It's watching. Although people talk about a second front opening up on the West Bank, it is important to note that there's no military force in the West Bank quite like Hamas in Gaza. Yes, Hamas does have a presence in the West Bank, and there are a lot of arms among various Palestinian groups in the West Bank, but there's nothing quite as strong as what you have with Hamas in Gaza. So if this did turn into something more serious, it would probably be another intifada where you have an uprising of Palestinians against the Israelis, but probably not something like a mass of missiles being fired toward Israeli territory like you got in Gaza in early October.
Okay, Paul Wallace, who runs our economics and government coverage in the Middle East, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Now, let's talk about the economic situation in the US. Bloomberg Economics now believes that they see signs of a typical recession having begun in October 2023, and therefore they expect that the Fed will have enough clarity about the downturn to then cut interest rates for the first time in March next year. Joining us now is Bloomberg opinion columnist Daniel Moss. Good to have you with us, Daniel. Earlier this week, Bill Ackman said that the Fed may cut rates in the first quarter. Bloomberg Economics now seems to agree and to back that call. And obviously it's been the main question for markets for the last few weeks.
It's been the main question for markets for about a year now, since the Fed began scaling down from half percentage point increases to 25 basis point increases to taking a little bit of a pause and now what looks like a prolonged, possibly permanent pause to hikes. So a year ago, when people started chattering about rate cuts for this year, that was off the mark. The chatter is now back. It's back with a force. But what gives it more credibility is that inflation is coming down at a pretty significant clip. Look at PCE, the Fed's preferred inflation measure. It's down to 3%, according to the data we got overnight. You're within cooee of an average of 2% over time there. You're not quite there, but the trend is really starting to look unambiguous.
When we look at the rally that we've seen on bond markets as well, markets seem to have decided this already. How much more difficult does that make the job for central bankers?
It means they are unlikely to talk in ways that are overtly sympathetic to that. So what you'll probably see is really critical Fed speakers perhaps coming away from remarks and commentators saying, well, a little bit on the hawkish side, a little bit, but that's because they don't want the market to get carried away with pricing in too many cuts too soon. I think it's also important to establish what we're talking about when we talk about the Fed. What I'm talking about are the voices that matter. And at the hinge points in policy, it's really critical to understand not all Fed speakers are equal. Keep your eye primarily on the triumvirate: the chair, the vice chair, and the head of the New York Fed. Other people in the FOMC sort of matter occasionally or situationally, but it's important not to get too upset or enthused by what some of the backbenchers say.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.